In economics, inflation is defined as the generalized and sustained increase in the prices. In other words, with the money I had before, I can buy less today. But how much less? The answer depends, since price increases usually last for a period of time. Inflation is generally referred as inflation over a year. In this way, we can say that if an annual inflation was 30%, the price of goods and services increased by 30% during the year. But let's see how it works with an example. Suppose that in the month of January we make a purchase at the supermarket, buying bread, cheese, and apples. Assuming that the price of each product is $1, we will have spent a total of $3. Then, at the end of the year, we went back to the same store and bought exactly the same. But now, we notice that instead of $3, we spent a total of $4. However, when we look in detail, we now see that not all products increase in the same proportion. Since bread costs $1.50 and both cheese and apples $1.25. So we can say that bread increased 50%, but apples and cheese only 25%. But then, is the inflation 25 or 50%? To answer this question, economics propose to create what is known as the Consumer Price Index. This index is nothing more than the price of a set of goods and services representative of household consumption. For our simplified example, the CPI at the beginning of the year will be the sum of the price of bread, cheese, and apples, $3, and at the end of the year, the value of the index will again be the sum of the prices of the same products, but now increased to $4. The inflation or price increase can be calculated following this formula. In this example, the value of the index at the end of the year is 4, and at the beginning was 3, resulting in an inflation of 33% during that year. 33% is a high value, but it's even worse if it's maintained over time. According to experts, a country's inflation can be classified into 4 main types: hyperinflation, galloping, walking, and creeping. Here we will group the last 2 under the term moderate to make the explanation easier. Moderate inflation is understood as a slow increase in prices. Thus, price can be considered stable and don't change radically from year to year. This is especially important, as it will allow consumers to maintain their purchasing power. In other words, buying the same items at similar prices. Inflation is considered to be moderate for values below 10% in a year. However, if inflation exceeds this 10%, it could turn into galloping inflation, where prices can rise at a higher rate, for example 100% in a year. This brings big changes in the economy, as the people start spending money more quickly before the prices rise. In other words, they keep enough money to live on, but it's no longer as convenient to save it, because it will eventually lose its value. And finally, hyperinflation, where colossal price increase occur in a very short time. This generates a strong crisis due to the rapid loss of the value of the money. In many cases, prices change on a daily basis. A clear example of this phenomenon was the hyperinflation suffered by Argentina in 1989, where inflation in that year was over 3,000%. And taking a more current example, we can look at the case of Venezuela, where it is currently reaching incredibly high levels. Now that we know what inflation is, it will be good to understand where it comes from. According to economists, inflation can be attributed to the sum of multiple effects, such as demand-pull inflation. This effect obeys the law of supply and demand. This means that if suddenly the demand for a good increases, but no extra units are produced to compensate for the demand, the price increases. In other words, this happens where many people wish to acquire a good or service, but there are very few available in the market, so the existing ones becomes more desirable and valuable, which results in an increase in their price. Inflation is also caused by an increase in cost. For example, when the price of a raw material used to produce a good rise, this leads to producers also having to increase their selling prices to compensate for the increase in the cost. The following cause is known as built-in inflation, where inflation occurs due to pessimistic expectation about the future of the economy, which cause prices to rise even though there is no real reason to do so. That is why this type of inflation is considered speculative, and to avoid it, credibility in public policies is needed. And finally, we will mention inflation due to emission of money, and this cause is very special. since it depends on the policies carried out by the country's central bank. In this case, inflation occurs when money is printed and put it into circulation, which in technical terms is known as increase the monetary base, which as we said, only means printing more money. This inflation is due to the fact that each one of these new bills decreases the real value of all the bills that already exist. And if before we need only one bill to buy something, now we will need a larger amount to buy the same thing, so the currency loses purchasing power. But the main point here is that this accumulates over time, because in general, countries don't tend to reduce the amount of money in circulation, but quite the opposite, which causes a progressive loss. As a consequence, those who suffer the most are the ones with limited economic resources, those with fixed salaries, and those who don't save in ways other than cash. That's why, unfortunately, it's also said that inflation is the tax of the poor, since they are the ones who suffer the most. But contrary to popular belief, inflation is not a bad thing in itself, it's only bad in excessive amounts. Today, most economic currents agree with a small rate of inflation. This is because, in a controlled manner, it boosts the economy of countries by encouraging consumption. As an example, developed countries, such as the United States, try to maintain an inflation rate of 2% per year, since zero or negative inflation could lead to a more severe economic recessions. That being said, let's now take a look at some values. If we look at the 2019 inflation rates of different countries, we can see that they were very different. According to the central banks of each country, Venezuela will be the country that experienced the highest inflation during that period. It can be classified as a hyperinflation state. It's followed by Argentina, with an inflation rate of 54%, which places it in a state of galloping inflation. And then other countries, such as Mexico and Brazil, with more moderate inflation rates. But it's also remarkable in the case of El Salvador, which during the same year showed a drop in the prices of almost 0.5%. In other words, it experienced the opposite phenomenon to inflation, known as deflation. Like most economic variables, inflation can change over time, which is why it's important to make decisions to reduce its effects on our savings. For this reason, in the next video we will talk about how to save with inflation and what can we do to benefit from it. If you think this content might help a friend or a family member, it might be a good idea to share it. And if you like the video, we invite you to like and subscribe to the channel to continue learning about this financial universe.